At just 21, Isabel Reed had already known more grief than many live through in a lifetime. Orphaned and alone, she carried the weight of memories far warmer than her present reality. Her stepmother, Veronica, saw her not as a person but as a burden, one that needed to be dealt with. In the quiet of their home, decisions were made behind closed doors, far from Isabel's voice or consent. And when she learned the price of her own life, it didn't come with mercy, only with a transaction. The number, $250,000, felt less like money and more like chains. Veronica's debts, piled from careless bets and shallow indulgences, now cost Isabel her freedom. The man who appeared to claim her wasn't cruel in voice or violence, but in silence and indifference. Damian Blackwood, the buyer, didn't even look her in the eye as Veronica coldly declared, "She belongs to you now." Imagine the sting of being handed over like property in a modern world where dignity should have no price. Isabel's protests meant nothing. Her words, her tears, irrelevant. In a society where real love is often commodified, this felt like the darkest version of that truth. The idea that a human life, especially one so young and full of dreams, could be bartered away under the guise of survival is the kind of real story that shakes you. It's a touching story, but not in the way you'd hope. It scratches at the parts of you that want to believe the world is just, then forces you to see what happens when it isn't. She tried to pack only what mattered, but how do you pack for a future you didn't choose? A small locket, a photo, an address that used to make her feel beautiful before everything fell apart. The rest didn't matter. She walked out of the house that no longer felt like a home and into a luxury car that reeked of detachment. Beside her sat a stranger who paid to own her future, yet didn't speak a word. Silence can scream louder than rage, and that car ride was deafening. In many ways, Isabel's story mirrors too many others. People forced into choices they never made, all for someone else's gain. She wasn't naive, but she had still hoped for kindness. Maybe deep down, she clung to the idea that anyone would call it off, that some hidden clause in fate would save her before the vows. But reality is rarely that generous. And so, she stepped into a world built on silence and steel, unsure whether she was walking into a mansion or a cage. Even as the gates closed behind her, her mind replayed her parents' voices, warm, hopeful, full of dreams for their daughter. That contrast was the sharpest cut. Life had once been soft. Now it was all sharp edges. Veronica had played her final hand, and Isabel was the wager. She didn't cry. Not then. Not when the car stopped. Not even when the doors opened to a house she didn't know, with people she couldn't trust. And yet, something in her stayed alert. Not hopeful, just awake. Because while she was sold, she refused to be erased. This wasn't love, and it wasn't family. But it was still her life, and she wasn't ready to hand over her soul just because someone else sold her name. And deep within the walls of that house, something waited. Not just danger or heartbreak, but perhaps something else entirely. The wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a transaction wrapped in lace and silence. Isabel stood at the altar in a dress that felt borrowed from someone else's sorrow, tight and unflattering, like a costume she never asked to wear. Damian, cold as stone, didn't even glance at her with the curiosity of a man meeting his bride. No vows of affection, no promises of forever, just paperwork and an audience of strangers with blank stares. Her hands trembled as they exchanged rings, but his grip was firm, indifferent, like he was closing a business deal. The room, filled with luxury, was void of warmth. No music could mask the absence of emotion. It was the kind of wedding people read about in tabloid nightmares, not something that should belong to a touching story. And yet, for Isabel, it was all horrifyingly real. A real story no one would ever believe unless they had lived it. That night, in the grand estate that now called her wife, she was led to a room that shimmered with gold but felt like a cell. She sat on the edge of the bed, bracing herself for what her stepmother had implied would come next. But Damien didn't follow. Instead, he stood in the doorway, voice low, almost distant. "I don't touch things that are bought." His words cut through the silence like frost through bone. She didn't even know what hurt more, his rejection or the implication behind it. As if her being sold had tainted her beyond worth. She wasn't asking for affection or intimacy, just humanity. She expected coldness, but not cruelty masked as morals. And now, here she was, alone in a palace where everything sparkled except the people inside it. The silence stretched through the walls. Isabel listened to the ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall, counting each second like a prisoner marking time. That room had every comfort money could buy, but no comfort at all. The walls were painted with elegance, the windows tall and arched, but the loneliness clung to every surface. She had been bartered, wedded, and now discarded, all in less than 24 hours. But beneath the layers of humiliation, something stirred in her. Not rage, not yet, but a flicker of resistance. Isabel wasn't going to let this be the end of her voice. She would not cry. She would not scream. She would survive. Because even in gilded cages, birds remember how to sing. And while Damien locked himself behind closed doors, she began unlocking her will to endure. And so the days began, not as a wife, not as a bride, but as a silent witness inside a house built by wealth and ruined by silence. But even in silence, things stir. Even in cold places, warmth can find cracks. And in a house this vast, Isabel was about to discover that emptiness isn't always empty, not completely. The days that followed were stitched together with silence and solitude. Isabel wandered the mansion like a ghost in silk slippers, each hallway echoing her own unanswered thoughts. Damien was a shadow that rarely appeared, always locked behind the polished oak doors of his office. No greetings, no glances, just absence. The staff barely acknowledged her, treating her with the same careful neutrality they gave to expensive furniture. She tried to fill the silence with books, but the words slipped through her like water. Nothing held her. No room felt hers. It was a world too large for one heart to bear. In a house full of things, not a single object belonged to her, not even the life she was living. That's the paradox of wealth. It can build empires and bury souls. It was the kind of real story that reminds you how loneliness isn't always found in empty rooms, but in ones overflowing with luxury and lack of love. One afternoon, searching for air that didn't smell like dust and old perfume, Isabel stepped into the garden. It was a place long forgotten, overgrown wild raw. And yet, something about the tangled vines and broken flower beds made her feel seen. Here was life that had also been neglected. The weeds didn't judge her. The silence didn't suffocate. It invited her to stay, to heal, to touch the earth with bare hands. She began tending to it, not for anyone else, but for herself, digging, pruning, watering. It became her rebellion, soft and persistent. Every blossom that bloomed was a quiet victory. She didn't need permission to make beauty out of ruin. The garden grew in patches, uneven but alive. It was the first place in this cold estate that pulsed with warmth, with her fingerprints, with emotional story in every root. There's something sacred about dirt under your nails when the world above feels unclean. In that garden, Isabel wasn't a wife. She wasn't a transaction. She wasn't someone's regret. She was simply human. And for the first time since arriving, she smiled. Not with joy, but with resolve. Like a flame refusing to go out in the wind. She couldn't change where she was, but she could decide who she would be inside it. And Damien? Still invisible, still silent. But Isabel no longer waited for him. The garden was her chapel now, and she prayed through labor, not words. Some days she spoke aloud to the roses, as if they could talk back. Maybe in a way they did. Life listens in places where people don't. The garden gave her purpose. A rhythm, a reason to rise from bed, even when her heart felt heavy with the weight of being unseen. But gardens grow more than flowers. They stir things. They wake things. And one day, when the sun was too hot and her hands too tired, Isabel collapsed among the lavender. The world spun. Her body gave out. And from somewhere beyond consciousness, someone called her name. Not cold, Not cruel, just a voice, distant, urgent. In that moment, that collapse would change everything. Isabel awoke to the sterile hum of hospital lights and the steady beep of machines, strange comforts after the silence of the mansion. Her body ached, skin pale from fever, muscles drained from weeks of quiet struggle in the garden. A nurse whispered that it was Mr. Blackwood who had found her. Those words didn't make sense. He barely looked at her. Why would he care? Yet there she was, not forgotten, not dead, and definitely not alone. Beside the bed lay a note, typed, brief, and signed, "Take on time. Don't die." Cold, unsentimental. But beneath the chill, something pulsed. A strange contradiction, like a hand extended but wrapped in barbed wire. It wasn't affection, but it wasn't neglect either. And in a life where Isabel had grown used to being invisible, even a distant concern felt like fire in winter. Touching stories aren't always sweet. They can sting and still be meaningful. Back at the mansion, she noticed subtle changes. A stocked medicine cabinet, a staff member offering soup without being asked. No apologies, no explanations, just quiet gestures that suggested someone was watching, maybe even listening. She had never expected kindness from Damien, but perhaps kindness wasn't the right word. Maybe it was duty, or guilt, or something he didn't have a name for yet. Late one night, a sound pierced the quiet, a scream, raw and human. Isabel followed it through the maze of hallways until she found a door slightly ajar. Inside, Damien was on the floor, clutching a photograph, his face twisted in grief. He didn't see her. He wasn't pretending anymore. The name Evelyn escaped his lips like a wound reopened. And for the first time, Isabel saw the man behind the marble mask, broken, grieving, and painfully alive. She didn't interrupt. She didn't comfort. She simply stood there, absorbing the sight like a canvas takes in paint. This wasn't about her, but explained so much. His distance, his coldness, the mansion's ghostly stillness. Damien wasn't just avoiding her. He was hiding from a past too heavy to carry. Isabel realized then that the prison wasn't hers alone. He was just as confined, only his bars were built for memory. After that night, things didn't change dramatically. He still vanished for hours. She still worked in the garden, but a strange awareness grew between them, like two satellites drifting just close enough to feel the other's gravity. Isabel no longer saw him as the villain in her emotional story. He was damaged, not evil, and something in her, despite everything, softened at the edges. It's easy to hate someone when you don't know their pain. But once you glimpse it, raw, unfiltered, it's almost impossible not to care even a little. And Isabel, despite herself, began to care. She didn't know what that meant yet. But as the days passed and the silence between them shifted ever so slightly, it became clear that pain might not be the only thing they shared. There's a strange kind of intimacy that comes not from touch, but from silence shared. Isabel began to paint, at first as therapy, then as language. Her brush carried the weight of things she couldn't say out loud. She painted the garden, the light through the window, the feeling of isolation. But one day, almost by instinct, she painted Damien, not as he was, but as she imagined he had once been. Softer, warmer, human. When Damien stumbled upon the painting, something in him stalled. It wasn't flattery. It was confrontation. The version of himself on the canvas stood in the rain, head bowed, drenched but unbroken. He stared at it for a long time, lips pressed tight, before finally asking her, "Why don't you ever cry?" It was a question weighted with more than curiosity. It was disbelief, maybe even guilt. The kind that lingers when someone realizes they've stopped noticing suffering. Isabel's answer was quiet but firm. "I choose to live. Not survive. Not endure. Live." That moment lingered in the room like a held breath. It was more than defiance. It was truth. And in that truth, something thawed between them. Not melted, not erased, just softened, like frost on glass, starting to clear, showing a shape behind it. It wasn't yet love, but it wasn't nothing. From then on, their encounters became less accidental. He passed by the garden more often. She began painting in spaces where he could see her work. Words were still few, but glances stretched longer. Moments lingered. This wasn't a romance. It was a reckoning. Two damaged souls orbiting the idea that maybe healing didn't require declarations, just presence. That's what makes this a real story, the kind you feel under your skin without realizing. Damien began asking questions, not just polite ones, but real ones. What she liked, where she learned to paint, why she chose lavender over roses. Isabel answered carefully, unsure how long this version of him would last. He listened, really listened. It was unsettling and tender all at once. And for the first time, she felt like someone saw her not as a transaction, not as a burden, but as a person. He never apologized for the past, not with words. But in these subtle shifts, Isabel felt something that mattered more than apology: growth. And in the quiet that followed their exchanges, a new rhythm formed. One where silence didn't hurt anymore, where solitude wasn't lonely, where the echoes in the mansion were no longer filled only with loss. And yet, no path to connection is without its storms. Beneath every warm glance was a question neither dared ask. Could something real come from something so broken? Could a spark grow where everything once felt frozen? These were not answers they were ready for. But one stormy night was about to offer more than questions. It would light the match that neither of them saw coming. The storm came with no warning, just sudden wind, rattling windows, and darkness swallowing the halls. The power flickered, then died. Candles were lit, their glow casting shadows that made the mansion feel older, more alive. Isabel wandered toward the sound of a match striking and found Damien in the library, sleeves rolled, face bare of pretense. In the candlelight, he didn't look like a millionaire. He looked like a man tired of being alone. They didn't speak at first, just sat near the fire, its soft crackling the only sound between them. Then, as if the storm outside shook loose something inside, Damien broke the silence. He spoke of Evelyn, his late wife, not like a fairy tale, but like a wound that never closed. His voice wavered as he admitted the guilt, the helplessness, the night he couldn't save her. It was the first time he'd ever told the truth without armor. Isabel listened, not as a victim, not as a savior, but as someone who understood what it meant to carry loss like a second skin. She didn't rush to comfort. She simply let the silence between his sentences breathe. That kind of listening is rare, sacred. It's the foundation of every emotional story that dares to reach deep enough. And when he finally looked at her, eyes wet with something that might have been hope, she didn't look away. What happened next wasn't dramatic. No grand declarations. No sweeping music. Just a touch, his hand over hers. Her head leaning gently toward his shoulder. And a kiss. Soft. Hesitant. Real. It wasn't a happy ending. It wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning, a fragile one, yes, but a beginning forged not in fantasy, but in survival. The kind of touching stories people carry with them because they mirror the complicated truth of healing. By morning, the storm had passed, but something in the house had shifted. The air felt lighter. Breakfast was shared in the kitchen, not in silence, but with half smiles and curious questions. They didn't talk about love. Not yet. But love was in the room, sitting quietly between them, waiting to be named. For the first time, Isabel didn't feel like someone passing through Damien's world. She felt like she belonged in it. Later that day, she returned to the garden. The sun broke through the clouds, kissing the petals she had once tended in tears. Damien watched her from the steps, not intruding, just witnessing. And in that shared gaze, a promise was born. Not written in ink, not spoken aloud, but felt. A choice. To begin again. Not because they had to, but because, despite everything, they wanted to. Yet, beginnings are never free of ghosts. The past doesn't vanish. It lingers, even as new roots form. But maybe, just maybe, what once broke them could also bind them. And as the wind danced through the garden leaves, Isabel glanced over her shoulder and smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time, it could be. So tell me, if you were in Isabel's place, would you have survived with that same quiet strength? Would you have trusted a man who bought you? only to find out he might be more broken than cruel? Do you believe love can truly be born from pain? Or do some wounds run too deep to heal? I want to hear what you think. Was Damien a villain at first, or just another prisoner of his past? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This story may be fictional, but the questions it raises are painfully real. And if this touching story stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to believe that healing is possible. That even in the darkest beginnings, light can still break through. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next emotional story, because the next one might just be the one that feels written for you.